Lots of people still coming in. Welcome to the Capitalism Can't Be Fixed and Canadian Foreign Policy Institute event tonight. We're going to be discussing Canada's role in the war on Iran. Feel free to say where you're joining from in the chat. Hello, everyone. We'll still give it like maybe a minute or so more for people to settle in. Hello, hello. Seeing some familiar faces. It's like the first time we've done this political education session, and it's been light out at this time for me at 6:30 in Montreal, which is nice. Hello, hello. Um, yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jasmine. I'm facilitating these political education sessions with the Capitalism Can't Be Fixed campaign. Today we're going to be discussing the war on Iran and Canada's role in it. We have two speakers, Yves Engler and Mona. Mona is a first-generation Iranian Canadian raised in Montreal, and they currently serve as the president of the board of directors of the Iranian Canadian Congress, where they support civic participation, community advocacy, and dialogue within the Iranian Canadian community. Previously, as vice president, they were one of the organization's official representatives to Canada's 2023 public inquiry into foreign interference, advocating in Ottawa for the rights and dignity of Iranian Canadians. And Yves Engler is an author of 13 books and activist here in Montreal as well. So we're going to start first with Mona, and then we'll move to Yves. And then after they both speak, we can take some questions from the audience. So write down any questions that you might have, and we can get started. Mona.
Thank you, Jasmine. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this critical conversation, and thank you, Yves, Jasmine, and organizers for putting this together. A bit about the Iranian Canadian Congress to start, or ICC. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and non-religious organization established in 2007 to represent the interests of Iranian Canadians and encourage their participation in Canadian society. Our vision is to build a united, progressive, flourishing, and influential Iranian Canadian community. So we've long been opposed to war, of course, any war, but given our mandate, especially the war against Iran, we also oppose sanctions on Iran, which are economic warfare and disproportionately affect ordinary civilian lives and the working class. As you can imagine, we've been very busy over the last few weeks since February 28th, speaking to the media, organizing on the ground with like-minded organizations such as the Palestinian Youth Movement and the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, and preparing statements and press releases against the war. You can read our statements on our website, which is iccongress.ca, and follow our social media accounts for any updates on protests or other events that we organize or endorse. And this presentation is formed mostly from statements and letters we've put out since the war began. And if there's anything I missed, please remember to bring it up in the Q&A. So to begin, on January 20th, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before global elites and painted a picture of a principled Canada. He spoke about a rupture in the world order. He committed Canada to the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter. What happened to that prime minister? Because the Mark Carney we're seeing now during the illegal US-Israeli war on Iran looks nothing like the one we saw at Davos. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a major aggression on Iran, violating the UN Charter. These unprovoked attacks, similar to the previous round of US-Israeli attacks on Iran in June 2025, occurred in the midst of diplomatic negotiations between Iran and the US, targeting not only military installations, but also civilian structures across Iran, including schools, hospitals, residential buildings, sports centers, and the Iranian National Broadcasting Headquarters. These war crimes parallel those committed against the people of Palestine in the Gaza Strip since 2023. In a horrific outcome of the US-Israeli aggression, the Shajare Tayyebe Girls Elementary School in Minab, southern Iran, was attacked. The strike, which occurred on the morning of February 28th, the beginning of the regular work week in Iran, resulted in the killing of at least 165 and injuring of at least 96 elementary school girls and educational staff. The United Nations Education Agency, UNESCO, has declared the attack a grave violation of humanitarian law. The US-Israeli strikes on Iran are ongoing, and the attacks on civilian targets and war crimes against the Iranian people are too many to list here. The head of state and supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with several members of his family, including his 14-month-old granddaughter, Zahra Mohammadi, was targeted and martyred at age 86 in his regular place of residence. The late Khamenei was both a political and spiritual leader, and his assassination has saddened and outraged people of conscience across the world, including Canada. We were dismayed by Carney's February 20th statement, in which the illegal, unprovoked US-Israeli war on Iran is framed as Iran-related hostilities. This is an outrageous misrepresentation of responsibility, victim blaming of the highest order. The statement indicates that Iran is the main source of instability in the region, despite the fact that Iran has not started a war of aggression against any country in over 200 years. Meanwhile, Israel, an apartheid regime which has committed genocide in Gaza and attacked 5 other countries over the past 2 years, quote unquote, has a right to defend itself. Carney further justified his position that Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. We'll come back to this. But days later, following pressure from Canadians horrified at the US-Israeli aggression, Carney had to walk it back, or at least he tried to add some nuance. He admitted that the US and Israel have acted without engaging the United Nations or consulting with allies, including Canada. He even expressed his support, quote, with regret, calling the conflict another example of the failure of the international order. Lloyd Axworthy, a former Liberal Foreign Affairs Minister, someone from Carney's own party, compared this moment to 2003, as many of us have also noted. He noted that, like the Iraq War, this attack could not be justified under the United Nations Charter. Carney's statement further indicates that Canada stands with the Iranian people, supporting the US in dropping explosives on the people of Iran and standing with the people of Iran who will continue to be killed and dismembered by those very bombs cannot be reconciled. Positions which attempt to hide or invert reality and policies which support war crimes undermine the credibility of the Canadian government. Furthermore, Carney's assertion that Iran must never be allowed to obtain or develop nuclear weapons is a tired propaganda point used to justify and manufacture consent for the war. The late Khamenei and all Iranian diplomatic teams have always indicated that Iran is not seeking nuclear weapons, a fact which has been verified by the most comprehensive inspections of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and testified under oath by the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. Meanwhile, Israel maintains nuclear ambiguity with zero recourse. There's also no legal basis for Canada or any other state to make such demands of any other sovereign nation. Iran, as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, reserves the right to develop and use its peaceful nuclear program for civilian applications such as research, medicine, and energy. But beyond the legal right, what about the actual threat? On March 17th, Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, one of the top intelligence officials in the United States government, resigned. In his resignation letter, Kent wrote, "I cannot, in good conscience, support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation." So where does that leave Carney? It leaves him endorsing a war that violates the UN Charter, was launched without congressional or allied approval, is contradicted by the IAEA's findings, and is openly disputed by a senior U.S. intelligence official who resigned in protest. This is what happens when you outsource your national security judgment to political convenience. Carney's position suggests that because the government of Canada dislikes the Iranian government, any action against that country, even an illegal one, is acceptable. This is the asymmetrical application of international law that Carney himself warned us against at Davos. It seems that the rules only apply when they are convenient. Carney, facing public pressure, has since softened his language, stating Canada will never participate in the offensive against Iran. But he has not retracted his statements claiming that Iran is the principal source of instability and terror throughout the Middle East. By endorsing this war, even with regret, Carney has undermined Canada's role as a middle power, let alone as a so-called peacekeeper. He has shown that when the chips are down, Canada will abandon the UN Charter to stay in Washington's good graces. The war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the US and Israel also expose the propaganda that Western governments want to help the people of Iran. This Western help has primarily been in the form of maximum pressure sanctions, hindering all aspects of daily life, including access to life-saving medication, as well as the assassination of Iranian leaders and scientists. One of our organization, ICC's core principles, is to call for the elimination of Canada's economic sanctions on Iran. Sanctions are laundered in the West as targeted to certain individuals or industries, with hypothetical humanitarian exemptions, but the actual punishing effects are borne by the Iranian working class. The International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, acknowledges that sanctions have, quote, wreaked havoc on the Iranian economy. Millions face poverty, insecurity, and extremely limited economic prospects, end quote. Furthermore, sanctions strengthen the position of the business owners who do manage to navigate them at the expense of workers. As Iranian legal scholar Helia Dutaqi explains, sanctions empower an oligarchic capitalist faction that operates as an extension of Western capitalism rather than its opponent. End quote. This even extends to essential medical care, with Human Rights Watch concluding that sanctions on Iran, despite humanitarian exemptions, quote, are causing unnecessary suffering to Iranian citizens afflicted with a range of diseases and medical conditions. This includes people with leukemia, epidermolysis bullosa, EB, a type of disease that causes fragile, blistering skin, or epilepsy, and individuals with chronic eye injuries from exposure to chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War. End quote. In other words, sanctions are economic warfare. They do not make it easier for Iranian workers to get their legitimate demands met. They harm Iranian families who struggle to put food on the table. They prevent average Iranians from accessing the pharmaceuticals and medical care they need. And the current war is an intensification of this decades-long economic war led by the US and supported by Canada. This is not conjecture. In 2019, former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated, quote, things are much worse for the Iranian people with the US sanctions, and we are convinced this will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior of the regime. End quote. We now bear witness to the barbaric conclusion of this economic siege. From the first day of the US-Israeli aggression, when the US double-tapped an elementary school, to the ongoing assault against Iranian citizens, infrastructure, and cultural heritage sites. We're all here today because we're angry at our Prime Minister's regretful support of the violent foreign policy of the US. Canadians are also dismayed by the lies, misrepresentations, and threats made by the current US president concerning Canada. Yet, the Canadian government also repeats the US line on Iran when it comes to sanctions and freezing diplomatic relations. The same suffering imposed through sanctions, economic warfare, to divide Iranian society and destroy its resistance to imperialism is now intensified to its inevitable conclusion, raining terror from the sky. The question for us now is, what do we do about it? How do we hold our government accountable? There's much we can do at home to resist. Stand up for Canada restoring diplomatic relations with Iran. Stand up against sanctions, which hurt working people. Stand up against lies, propaganda, and repression of anti-war voices. Stand up against those who divide us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. Really, thank you. It's really nice that you humanize the effects of sanctions because it's so distant from us and it's just this thing that's abstract thing that's happening. But when you talk about, the effects of sanctions, like we need to hear that. We need to know. And yeah, your final point, like it does take bravery to stand up. So thank you for your bravery in doing this. And I saw you over the weekend doing a talk as well. So I know that you're doing this as much as you can, and we really appreciate that. Next, we'll move to Eve.
Thanks, Jasmine. Thanks, Mona. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. So, yeah, what I thought I would talk about is just the history of Canada's relations with Iran. And they begin, obviously, Canada is a dominion of the British Empire, very passive, begin with the interest of uh, Britain, what becomes British Petroleum, in Iranian oil. Um, um, and so it begins with the British Petroleum's interests in Iran, which steadily become more significant. And it's wildly profitable for British Petroleum. And there is a growing desire among Iranians to get a better share of the huge profits that are being extracted from their natural resources. And it culminates in elected prime minister trying to get better terms, British Petroleum and the British government, UK government being exceedingly hostile. And that forces the hand of Mossadegh to nationalize BP. And the Canadian government's response, Lester Pearson in the House of Commons in 1951, is to criticize Iran's actions and is to basically say the British have been well administering Iranian resources, and this is wrong for the country to get better results from its resources. So Canada backs, in a passive way, the coup of 1953 that's led by the UK and the CIA against Mossadegh, and it's a very elaborate coup of all kinds of different forms of destabilization. Canada backs that quietly. At that point, we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran, but soon after the coup, in 55, we set up diplomatic relations. And of course, the Americans install or return the Shah to power. And over the next 26 years, Canada supports the Shah's rule and Canadian business relations. He comes here in 65 and the red carpet is brought out. As late as late 1978, the Premier of Ontario goes on a trip. Canada sells weapons through the 70s, sells weapons that go to the SAVAK, the repressive internal force. And there's basically a deepening of business and political relations through the 70s, through the Shah's period, which is quite repressive. And it's a monarchy. It's not even, it's not a pretense of being a democratic government. Then in the 79 revolution, Canada breaks relations with Iran in 1980, just after the revolution. And through the 1980s, Canada supports passively, well, through arms sales, the Iraq aggression against Iran. Through the 1980s, this is a devastating war that leads to hundreds of thousands of people being killed. Saddam Hussein's Iraq unleashes chemical weapons and the like. And Canada sells weapons to Iraq during this period. So it's a form of support for this aggression against the country that we break off diplomatic relations after they overthrow their monarchy. at the end of the decade, Canada restarts diplomatic relations, and they operate at a very low level through the 1990s. There's a certain amount of business activity. It's very minimal. But there is, the fairly significant number of Iranians that do come to Canada. Some of them after the Iranian Revolution, supporters of the Shah, like Nazanin. I'm forgetting her last name, McKay, the wife of the of conservative MP Peter McKay, whose father owned the Sheraton Hotel or ran the Sheraton Hotel in Tehran, and was somewhere very close to the Shah. So there's a certain element of emigration like that, and there's others who leave also who are unhappy with the direction of the Iranian Revolution and others. But through this period, there's a sort of low level relations. There's a certain amount of business activity. The hostility really ramps up in the mid 2000s when Stephen Harper's government comes to office. There's Canada, one of the reasons, an element of Canada's position in Afghanistan is to keep an eye on Iran. And there was push to have Canada's embassy in the western part of Afghanistan to be closer to Iran to spy and to sort of there's Canadian naval vessels that are patrol off the coast in like 2007, 2008, 2009 that are sort of running provocative maneuvers as part of a sort of conflictual dynamic with the Iranian government. And ultimately, the Harper government breaks off diplomatic relations in 2012. So over the past 15 years, Canada has not had diplomatic relations with Iran. Countries like the UK and France and most of the world, of course, have those relations. So Canada is very much isolated against the rest of the world in having no embassy in Tehran. At the same time, the Harper government lists Iran as a state sponsor of terror. And there's only two countries put on the state sponsor of terrorism list at that time, which is Canada, or which is Iran and Syria. And Syria was just taken off. Now that there's a former Al Qaeda leader that leads Syria, now they just in December they took Syria off. So the only country on Canada's state sponsor of terrorism list is Iran. At the same time, you have a whole series of sanctions that have been adopted against the different Iranian officials. And it's just a sort of like steadily growing number of sanctions that have reinforced the much more substantive and consequential US sanctions. And I think after Russia, Iran would be Canada's second most sanctioned country. Also, you have in more recent a period, about 2 years ago, the Trudeau government lists. Oh, actually, I'll back up a bit here. Now, the Trudeau government, before it comes to office, it says it wants to restart diplomatic relations with Iran. That's a promise Trudeau makes before being elected in 2015. And there's actually quite a bit of support for that. There's a parliamentary petition, I believe the Iranian Canadian Congress instigates sometime in like the 2016, 2017 kind of period that gets like 16 or 17,000 people that sign it. There is a real push. There's a segment of Canada's corporate class that wants to restart diplomatic relations because they want to basically do business with Iran, and specifically Bombardier. They want to sell planes to Iran. And there's a push within with Stéphane Dion, who is Trudeau's first minister, foreign affairs minister, until early 2017, where they try to restart diplomatic relations. And that's basically scuttled by the Israel lobby, working within the Liberal caucus, Michael Levitt and Anthony Housefather. And there's a good article, academic article about this period of what happens in the background from that very establishment university, Junot, I think it's Thomas Junot, the University of Ottawa prof, former Canadian military guy. And so basically the push to restart diplomatic relations that Trudeau had promised is scuttled by the Zionist forces in the country. And part of what the Harper government did when they put Iran on the state sponsor of terrorism list, they made it very difficult to restart the diplomatic relations because there's all these lawsuits that get instigated against Iran in Canada. And in fact, the Canadian courts even basically contravene international law and award the Iranian assets in Canada to these Americans. Actually, they're claiming that Iran backed Hamas and Hamas blew up some facility in Israel, and these Israeli Americans were their family members were harmed, and so they're suing Iran and Canada. It's a very convoluted kind of like logic to it all, but there is these awards of Iranian assets in Canada on these so-called anti-terror kind of charges, and it's tied to the being listed on the state sponsor of terrorism list. And that people say that was designed that way by Harper to basically scuttle a future government's ability to restart, make it more difficult for a future government to restart diplomatic relations with Iran. So then in the after you have Trump, where he rips up the JCPOA nuclear accord, reinstalls the maximum pressure sanctions, and then kills General Soleimani. And then in the aftermath of that, there's this terrible error. I think it was an error. It was not intended, but the Iranians, of course, blow up a plane. There's a lot of Canadians of Iranian descent on that plane. That is then very much used to snowball in the direction of kind of anti-Iranian policy. And you have people like Erwin Kotler and Zionist forces that are very much, jump on this to re-push this anti-Iran kind of policy. And so over the past 6 or so years, Canada has really gone down an increasingly conflictual policy towards Iran, where 2 years ago, the part of Iran's military is listed as a terrorist organization. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is listed as a terrorist organization, and as far as I understand, it's the only country's military that's on Canada's terrorism list. And this is a pretty, escalation. There's like 190,000 members of in the IRGC, and then you got all this whole kind of push of this right-wing talking point you hear a lot today of the idea that Iran is or that there's IRGC members are overrunning Canada, and there's 700 top officials of the IRGC in Canada and stuff like that, as if Canada hasn't labeled this organization a terrorist organization, as if Canada hasn't put Iran on its terrorism state-sponsored terrorism list, as if Canada hasn't sanctioned Iran, as if Canada hasn't brought in multiple rounds of sanctions against Iran. The idea is that like we're being too nice to Iran, we're being too soft on Iran. That's kind of the framing, the utility of this whole conservative party and just general right-wing talking point of the IRGC is all over Canada. It's not really based in a whole lot of fact, from what I can tell. We can get into more of that in the discussion. So Canada has very much laid the groundwork for this assault on Iran. I don't think you can. They boast about it. They don't deny it. They're open about it. That we sanction them, we cut off relations, and all this kind of stuff. The Trudeau government, Carney boasts about labeling IRGC as a terrorist organization, etc. Now, what's happened over the past little bit? Canada is part of this war. It's part of this war. Even if we weren't militarily involved, we would be part of the war because of what I've just laid out. But we are part of the war, and we're part of the war through NORAD. Through NORAD, a couple hundred Canadian soldiers are part of NORAD command structures. They are definitely providing intelligence, satellite, and the like to this war of aggression. Canada has a base in Kuwait that is part of a U.S. connected to a U.S. compound. In fact, it was hit. Apparently, according to La Presse, it was hit on March 1st when there was a number of Americans killed on the base. Canada has a certain number of soldiers, part of U.S. officer exchanges that are part of in the region in West Asia that are part of U.S. units that are involved in this fight. There's Canadians all throughout the U.S. military command structure that again certainly involved in this war in different ways. Mona laid out some of the diplomatic language and rhetoric, the immediate support of the war that Carney stated right early in the morning on the 28th. So there's a certain amount of diplomatic support. What we're seeing now is the government is leaving a door open for what they're saying is engagement in a defensive role. Now, what would a defensive role be in the context of this massive aggression? So they've suggested that if the Gulf states ask for Canadian assistance, there's some opening on the possibility of fulfilling Donald Trump's demand or desire for efforts to open up the Strait of Hormuz. I think there's a possibility that Canadian special forces are in the Kurdish area of Iraq. They have a long-standing relationship to the Peshmerga Kurdish forces in Iraq. We saw a French soldier that was killed recently there. There's been certain discussion there. That's a certain possibility. There's a NATO ties, the NATO base in Turkey and Greece that appear to be involved maybe in some of the operations. So Canada is definitely involved. Now, the Carney government is hesitant to openly get involved here for a good reason. The polling is absolutely clear cut. More than 74 to 10 in a recent Angus Reid poll, 74% to 10% that don't want Canada to be involved. And the National Post today has this headline where another poll, a Leger poll that goes in a slightly different question, but comes to similar type of conclusions. The public doesn't want this at all. And the National Post, today's National Post, has a headline about saying that one in five of 18 to 24-year-olds are explicitly saying they support, as the National Post puts it, the Iranian regime against the U.S. Right? So the younger population is more hostile to Israel, more hostile to this war of aggression, and apparently one in five of them actually want Canada's support politically, as the National Post puts it, the Iranian regime. So the public is not on board for this. Now, so that's part of why Carney is in a tough spot to do what Trump wants. The other part is that Trump's absolutely out of control from a marketing standpoint. I mean, he's a disaster. He's like literally joking about how we might keep bombing Carg Island just for the fun of it. That's a quote. He can't come up with one story, unlike George W. Bush, which WMD, and you at least had a certain consistency to the marketing strategy. Trump is all over the map on what the aims are and that, and so that puts traditional U.S. allies, and the history is Canada usually supports U.S. wars of aggression in the region, as I can get into in further detail. It puts them in a bind because the marketing is terrible. And then you get into what is I don't believe that Trump has a clear strategic aim here. Israel does have a clear strategic aim. Israel wants destruction. It wants weakness. It wants subordination. It wants regional dominance. The Greater Israel Project is weakness everywhere around. They don't care if it's civil war. They don't care if the country's divided. They don't care if it's a coup. They want weakness. They don't want just the destruction of the Iranian military. They want destruction of Iranian industrial capacity. They want a genocidal Jewish supremacist state of about 9 or 10 million to dominate a region of 500 million. And it doesn't matter how many are killed in that project. It doesn't matter how much environmental destruction, and with the destruction we saw today of the natural gas facilities and the oil facilities. It doesn't matter how much that's the aim. That's the logic. From Israel's perspective, I think the logic is pretty straightforward. From the U.S. empire standpoint, there is logic. I mean, I think ultimately the idea of subordinating Iran's oil has a logic from the U.S. empire, and obviously just subordinating Iran in a general sense has a logic. But the destabilization that will come to many NATO countries by the balkanization of Iran, that is not something that Washington wants. What's happening with the GCC countries is not something that it's a problem for Washington as well. Nonetheless, so I think that Carney is hesitant to embark fully in this project because one, Trump is such a catastrophe when it comes to the marketing of it, and that two, he understands that the Israeli aim here is really cataclysmic. It is a really horrible aim that is going to have reverberations for years, if not decades, if not even century kind of dynamics. So I think that that's the combination of Canadian public opinion and these dynamics is what's made Carney a bit more hesitant. We obviously need to keep up that pressure. We've been calling for Canada to shut down that base in Kuwait. There's no reason for the base in Kuwait. Let's get all the Canadian troops that are in the region out of the region. The 200 they've admitted, there's 200 in the region. Let's get them all out. I think we should restart diplomatic relations with Iran. We should remove Iran from the state sponsor of terrorism list. We should end the sanctions. We should reverse the theft of Iranian assets, and we should apologize for our role, not a major one, but nonetheless a role in the 1953 coup that undercut Iranian democracy. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yves. Lots of context there. It's definitely appreciated for all of us. Now I guess we'll go into a question period. Yuri, I'll ask you to unmute.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you to both Yves and Mix Ghassemi. I have a question for both of you, and here goes. So my first question to Mix Ghassemi is: are you shocked by how much there has been a large Iranian diaspora who wants both Trump and Israel to do military actions to oust the Islamic Republic, and then others who simply believe in Western economic terrorism and sabotage? And how do we try to convince people who might have legitimate grievances with the Islamic Republic that supporting Western imperialism is simply not the way forward? And then, Yves, my question to you is, doesn't everything, when we look at the history of Iran, that everything that Iran has been through, doesn't that vindicate what you advocate in international relations, that we must first do no harm? And I say this because, contrary to popular anti-imperialist frameworks, the Islamic Republic of Iran was actually groomed by Carter, France, the UK, and its allies. And they actually supported ousting the Shah in replace of the Islamic Republic. But the moment Khomeini started to be very hostile towards Israel and wanting, more, less exploitations of the oil, then the West, including the USSR, backed Saddam Hussein's brutal aggression against Iran, and even then, Israel actually was supporting the Islamic Republic of Iran against Saddam Hussein because Israel thought Saddam was way too pro-Palestine. And then, of course, with the Iran-Contra scandal, it all is like one huge, cluster F. And so, and so, given all that, doesn't that show that, like, okay, if we really are against imperialism, then we have to just not support any form of imperialism, let the Iranians themselves do what they want with the Islamic Republic, and we should just be, hands off Iran? I'm very curious both of your responses.
Thank you. Yves, do you want to go first, or should I go first? It was a long question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so for my side, I guess I will, if I'm surprised by the reaction of the Iranians who want war, it's this kind of response. I don't think I've seen anything quite like it. However, we're also living in kind of unprecedented times with this full-on war on Iran. But we saw in the last couple of years with the genocide in Palestine, we saw those same lion and sun monarchist flags among the Israeli protesters or counter protesters, depending on the context. But so that's where that association started to become clear for me. And so now, we continue to see them in the same context. But I feel like part of that is, I don't know if manufactured is the right word, but I think there's definitely some element of these people being, convinced to that side for whatever reason, and some of them probably have, some relationships with their alliances are, their fascist alliances, essentially. But and as you've stated, how can we convince some activists who are critical of the Iranian government to stand firmly against the war? I'm actually been involved, not necessarily of my choosing, in some of these debates, and I'm noticing that there's a bit of a shift from non-Iranian like anti-war activists to step away from that, while certain actors are in the Iranian diaspora who have pushed for sanctions and whatnot on Iran. I feel like there's a political gain for certain actors. There are some famous personalities within the Iranian diaspora in Canada who are in political positions that I think serve to stand to gain from forming alliances with, the rich and powerful. So, so that's kind of my response about why we might see that in some cases. Just to be in the Canadian political class and maintain that position, I think requires some kind of this sort of positioning. I think that's pretty much my answer, and Yves can go ahead with the rest of the items.
Yeah, it's very important that people understand that diaspora politics are shaped by broader Canadian power structures, of course, right? Like that is absolutely, and that's with all. I've seen it with the Haitian community here in Montreal. You see with all kinds of communities. There's an uplifting of those voices that align with imperialism, in this case, imperialism and Zionism. I totally agree. I think the first do no harm should be at the center of Canadian internationalism, and it should be internationalism in Canada should be focused not in some sort of abstract, okay, well, we need to support the protesters in Tehran, but in how is our government and our political culture contributing to injustice, imperialism, in this case, the worst form of all, open aggression. And so there's a lot of people on the left that got very much seduced by the notion, and this happens almost every time, right? Like this is not a new story; it's not an Iran specific story. Maybe the dynamics were particularly egregious, but in every case, there's always a claim about human rights violations. You look at Libya in 2011, is like Gaddafi was handing out Viagra to sub-Saharan African mercenaries who were raping people, and it was just all like just concocted, right? You go into an example like Haiti in 2004, where you have like a government that you don't get better democratic credentials. You do not get better democratic credentials than the Jean-Bertrand Aristide government. They won like almost every single position. Aristide was, according to USAID polls, the most popular politician in the country by like 13 times. They did a whole kerfuffle about how he was repressive and he was undemocratic and all. Like this story is each time. There are varying degrees of truth to this story, but it's it's the same story, right? We're doing this because they're bad and we have to do the intervention. So that has to be understood for leftists. And I think, as an abstraction, I want to be in solidarity with all social movements everywhere in the world as some sort of like abstract principle. But in the real world, we're living, if not in the belly of the beast, pretty damn close to the belly of the beast. And you have to take the policies of your government and your political culture. And I can just say that's what you have to work on. And I can say that I can say with a high degree of confidence, there's not enough hours in the day for any individual to devote to the different elements of the unjust Canadian foreign policy. So like after your 24 hours a day of working on Canadian foreign policy, then you can have your abstract solidarity with the people in the streets of whatever country you say you want to be in abstract solidarity with. But there is so much nefariousness to Canadian foreign policy that we have so much work to do. So that, it's not perfect. It's not, again, there's abstract what you'd want, and then there's the real world. But I think it's very clear to me on Iran that there is a lot of leftists that helped lay the groundwork to make this possible. And I don't just say that leftists as like the NDP. The NDP, I just wrote a story about the NDP's, consistent over more than 15 years on that. But I mean far further into the left, far further into the left, people who very much should know better. And there's a statement that it just was put out by I think it was on the New Politics site, Gilbert Achcar. He's, I think, the sponsor of it. And people like Greg Albo at York and Sam Gindin signed this statement that was just put out. It's supposedly like a criticism of the war against Iran, but it's a two sides kind of thing, and including like criticism of Iran for being like anti-Western and being like anti-Zionist. It's actually stunning that in 2026 there'll be like leftist profs at York that are signing things that are saying like, the thing to support Iran on is its hostility to Zionism, is its rhetoric against imperialism, and right, like that's what's. I think that when it comes to like domestic policy, I don't want to that's not my thing, but there's a lot more reason to be critical. It's Iran's role in backing the resistance to genocide in Gaza. That's what's to be like celebrated, right? That's the element that so. It's kind of stunning to see some leftists that are doing that still, 2.5 weeks into this horrible war. But that's where it is, and I think we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to change that political culture that we're operating in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll do Samir.
Thank you. It's actually a little bit difficult the way how I want to share my thoughts. First, I am Syrian. I immigrated to Canada in 2005. I haven't been during the uprising in Syria from the 11 until the nightmare happens recently. The challenge that I am facing in the scenario of the Iran and America is a kind of difficult case, and I want to know how Yves thinks about this. So the question is to Yves. I don't want to be viewed as I am supporting to the Iranian regime, but also I don't want the change to come from any Western country, specifically America or Israel. The regime in Iran, when it came in the 1979 revolution, it came actually as an option for the Western countries. It was the communists who possibly may win in Iran, but actually the Western, they push, you say, you know what, we get used to those kind of things. We know Saudi Arabia, we know other Salafists, we can deal with them. So surprise, surprise, they couldn't deal with them. So they were surprised that this Iranian new regime wasn't easy to deal with. In the same situation in Palestine, in Gaza, I am happy that Hamas is resistance, but I don't want to be viewed as a one who is agreeing with the ideology of Hamas. Same in Syria. I am so sad to see the Salafist is now ruling Syria, but I wasn't also with Assad regime. I didn't want that change to happen by America or Israel or any Western countries. Actually, I ran away from Syria. One of the reasons is the brutality of the Assad regime. So it's kind of difficult case when you are running away from a system you don't agree with, but also you don't want this system to be demolished or changed by a superpower to be eventually an agent to that power. So how do you view this, all these complicated things, and how we can stand alone as a leftist or as a progressive thinker people in a way that we can be ourselves, not to fall into this, I am now supporter to the Iranian regime and I am not supporter of the Iranian regime. How can we be out of this and then stand on the right side of history? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I just kind of jumping off what I said previously. To me, it's to focus on Canada, and I get this. I say this as someone who was born in Vancouver and has basically lived my whole life here. So it's a little bit different than somebody who is fled a country or a region or whatever to shape their position. But that to me is what we have more than enough to deal with in terms of Canada's role in the assistance of the greatest purveyor of violence over the past century, which is, of course, the U.S. empire. And then, in this context specifically, our assistance to maybe the pound for pound or per capita size greatest purveyor of violence over the past 70 years, which is Israel. We have so many forms of support for the U.S. empire or for Israel that there is not enough hours in the day to try to work on disconnecting Canada from assisting those two countries who are responsible for so many horrors, that we can devote our energy in that way. Now, I don't think for some people that's not a sufficient answer, and obviously people from diaspora communities. I've stated myself that with regards to Iran, if someone, I don't think I should or have an opinion. I support the Iranian government or not. I just do I support the government in Botswana? Do I support the government in Nepal? This need to have a position on the Iranian government comes from imperial culture in Canada. People in Botswana are not being leftists in Botswana are not feeling the need to go on to Twitter or Facebook and say, I disagree with the Iranian government, or I want, I've got to overthrow the Iranian government, but I also get against American imperialism. They don't feel that need. That is something that comes out of our imperialist political culture. Having said that, if someone from the Iranian community in Canada takes the position that they want, like I stated, I said it somewhat tongue in cheek, but I really mean it. Like, if your position is restart Canadian diplomatic relations with Iran, down with the regime, who am I to tell Iranian Canadian to be against, to say that they don't want that government? I'm not going to tell them to be, not to be against that government, but I am going to tell them that I think it's wrong for the Canadian government to decide it's not going to have relations with Iran when Israel, which we have like so many different ties to, is unleashing horror everywhere. Or if you want to take it on a more sort of Islamophobic terms, Saudi Arabia is more repressive towards women, is less democratic than Iran. So why do we have diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia? And we don't just have diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, we're selling them weapons. So to me, it doesn't seem coherent to say restart diplomatic relations with Iran, down with the regime. But if someone in the Iranian community takes that position, I'm okay with that. That to me is a principled position. Now, I do want to make a point a bit go further than this, and I'm going to speak about two people in specific. One in Nima Machouf, someone who is Iranian Canadian, that is a Canadian politician. They are Canadian. They are talking to a Canadian audience. And that's not, in my opinion, as a leftist, to engage in stuff like that, that's not acceptable. That you're not, at that point, you are not acting. When you've run repeatedly for the NDP in Montreal, and you've been in Canada for however many years, and your politics are all here, you now I don't believe you have that, you don't have that right to say, I support the overthrow of the government. Now you're in the realm of you're a Canadian politician, and in that realm, I think morally as I've laid it out, you should call for restarting diplomatic relations, ending sanctions, removing state sponsor of terror, et cetera, et cetera. This unfair isolation of Iran that is part of an imperial project against Iran. So there is no clear answer. So again, in the case of Syria, if someone in Syria wanted to say, Canadian say, down with Assad, but Canada shouldn't be supporting Operation Sycamore, the CIA, bid to overthrow and destabilize. That again, that to me, that's coherent. The political position has to be based in part on where you are, right? We don't just take a position based upon abstract. Being in Canada and speaking to a Canadian audience and being tied to a whole series of state and non-state political culture requires a certain politics. There's a responsibility that comes with being in that position. And so again, it's not totally, I get why for some diaspora communities that might not always be totally easy or straightforward to sort of navigate. Are you in Canada and dealing with Canadian political culture, or are you, Iranian or whatever diaspora? But I think that we have to think about it through those kind of lens.
Yeah, thank you, Yves. Samir, I see that you put your hand up again. Did you want to respond quickly, or was it another question?
Yeah, actually, if it's possible. Of course, I am not in Syria. I am in Canada. I consider myself Canadian. Syrian Canadian is okay. And I've been here for almost 20 years now. So I am blended with everything Canadian related. And I like what Yves says, actually. It's very good to stand from the imperialism point of view, from capitalism point of view. But the problem is that we're sitting in a global ball today, as if we're actually all connected. So if I am here, I'm not isolated from what's happening in Syria or in any other country. So my stand here is connected. And my view to anything happens here, it's randomly connected. Now, where the dilemma is, when I am in Canada and I am driving on the right side of the road, everyone understands me. When I talk, I'm going to go for a ride. But let's say if I am talking now in Japan, no one will understand when I say I'm going to drive. They think I'm going on the left side of the road. So it's kind of clarifying our stance as leftists from the entire global issues is also important. I cannot just speak as a Canadian to a Canadian mind. I want to speak as a Canadian to everyone's mind as much as possible. And that's how we can differentiate us from, let's say, right wing who's opposing the Zionism. They oppose the Zionism. Tucker Carlson is not with the Israel. He's against the way, but from the different stand that we stand in. So we need to stand in a way that express ourselves in a very clear way. And I am finding it until now is the challenge to just narrow it down into, I am Canadian, I want to speak to this Canadian. I don't know if this argument, it makes sense.
Yves, you're muted.
I mean, I don't want to repeat stuff. Ultimately, I believe we should try to have a scenario in the world where we have like in real internationalism, we should break down borders, and we shouldn't have nation states ultimately And I would like to see a global redistribution of wealth, something like our transfer payments within Canada, where wealthier provinces transfer to less well-off provinces, and we believe in some degree of trying to equal out differences. I think we should have that happen at a global scale, and I think we should have it happen through some sort of international body that was truly representative of the world. The UN isn't that, though it's better than other major institutions. But like in the here and now, Canadian aid is a tool of domination for the most part, right? So like these things are really they're not straight, they're not easy to deal with. There's no like easy answer to most of these a lot of these questions. And so I'm not like a principled. I'm an internet. I actually genuinely am an internationalist. Unlike some of these like American, Tucker Carlson, who's like, it's not in Canada and not in the U.S., so I don't care about it. I genuinely believe that in internationalism and that we're all equal and we want to like work that in that direction, and break down borders and stuff like that, and have equality in the world, close to equality at least. But in the current imperial structures, it's very difficult to navigate calling for Canada's engagement anywhere, because Canada's engagement is so overwhelmingly negative. It's so overwhelmingly designed to support the empire and support Canadian corporate interests. And so navigating like, some demand, I don't know if that answers your question, but that goes a bit in the direction of like, yes, we want to have principled leftist anti-imperialism, internationalism. I think principled leftist internationalism, anti-imperialism means something different sitting in Montreal than it does sitting in Washington, D.C., than it does sitting in Paris, than it does sitting in Mexico City, than it does sitting in Tehran, than it does sitting in Kampala, Uganda. There are differences, and we have to like, take those political cultures into it. And it's not, I'm not saying it's always easy or straightforward, but yeah.
Thank you. We'll take the next two people at the same time. So if you can keep your question kind of short, we'll do Catherine and then we'll do B. Sandhu. Catherine, if you wanted to unmute yourself. Okay, well, she's figuring that.
So sorry, I'm here. Sorry, I had a hard time getting that.
Sorry, Catherine, you're breaking up quite a bit.
Oh, let me turn off my video. Is that better?
Yeah, that's way better.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the danger of nuclear weapons in this conflict. Obviously not Iran's, since they don't have any, but Israel and the U.S., particularly Israel, because Netanyahu had apparently said something about if this goes badly, that Iran will see something they've never seen before. So yeah, I'd just like to hear what people have to say about that potential. Yeah.
And then B. Sandhu, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, my question is for Yves, and I would just like to, I would appreciate if you'd explored a bit more on his thesis that vis-a-vis the Canadian left and positions on Iran. And I just, for context, Yves referenced a survey, a polling survey that was done. In fact, it came out yesterday by Angus Reid. And here's what defines those. So those voters who are going to vote for Liberals, committed to vote Liberals, 88% are saying that Canadian military should not be involved in Iran. NDP, interestingly, is 83. Bloc Québécois is 81. So this is not the sort of the leadership or, for whatever positioning that they might be doing, politicians, but it's actually generalized voters who've have, I guess, inculcated the points that Yves been talking about. So I would like to know, if, Yves, what's really going on, because it's more than just the attitudes of the political bigwigs. It's actually those who intend to vote NDP or Bloc Québécois are actually more supportive of Iran intervention in Iran than liberals. Thank you.
Thanks. Did either of you have a response to those questions? Mona, did you have anything?
I think I'll let Yves go ahead and answer the question that was addressed to him about nukes. I mean, I'm also concerned, but I don't have any further commentary.
Yeah, all I'd say nukes. I don't think the nukes question is a very serious one. I mean, it's always a serious question, and if you took the nukes question seriously, they should be bombing in Tel Aviv and bombing in Washington D.C. Right? The only country that's ever used a nuke, and both Israel and the U.S. have nukes. This notion that it's the idea that they're bombing Iran to something about nukes is wild, right? That's just the world flipped upside down. But the polling, I think, I mean, I think the discrepancy between the Bloc and the NDP and the Liberal supporters is not, it's pretty minimal discrepancy there. And it's very strongly against war, Canada's direct involvement in the war. Now, the left position is, I mean, they've supported. I did a piece on NDP. If you even look at Heather McPherson's statement in January, who was the foreign affairs critic, of course, the leadership candidate, her statement in January is boasting that she's like led the charge for sanctions and was pushing to have the IRGC listed as a terrorist organization. And she describes the repression in January in a completely unidimensional. It's just the repressive Iranian government. Anyone who paid attention to Twitter to look at like what the Zionist influencers on Twitter were doing in late December and early January knew there was like a destabilization plot in the works. And you didn't even need to pay attention to Twitter. If you just go back and you know what happened in the summertime, you knew Israel was going to start a new war. I mean, like it was, they didn't, the 12 days, Iran was able to provide some punishment on Israel, and that's just unacceptable from Israel's perspective. They were going to restart it. They were going to try to, push the Americans further into it as a way of weakening or dividing or undermining a government in the region that was providing some check to their power. That was just straightforward. And then you look at what the Scott Bessent, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Commerce Secretary, whatever his official title is, where he boasts about how the U.S. sanctions and then the currency manipulation is what led the bank collapse and Iranian bank collapse, and then that leads to the protests in late December, which begin as shopkeepers who are importing stuff, and all of a sudden the currencies collapsed, and so the prices are just totally out of whack, and so they begin protests like that, and then it spirals into something that clearly had, and this is not an argument that there wasn't significant state repression, but there was significant destabilization that was part of that. And then they just start going off in like wild territory with the number of people killed. And now people are saying there's 80,000 killed. Some people say 32,000 killed in over 2 days. And then simultaneously they'll say, well, Israel's hacked into all of the street cameras in Tehran, but they never provide us footage of all these people that were killed, right? They've hacked into all the video. On one hand, the Zionists will boast about having done that, but then they won't provide us the footage of the people being killed. It's just like the level of incoherence in some of this stuff is remarkable. But Heather McPherson joins in that. I mean, that was a culmination of Heather McPherson for years and years and years supporting monarchist forces in Canada and other, U.S. empire-aligned forces in trying to isolate Iran. So this goes back, a long time. And I did an event at Alternatives with Nima Machouf, Amir Kadir, and two other people, or one other person from the Iranian community 6 weeks ago or something like that. And then Canadian Dimension publishes this piece that's just like on, talks about campists and is like this attack against me and, the campists who are like concerned with Canada's role in laying the groundwork for a U.S.-Israeli attack against Iran. So even that far into the left, like Canadian Dimension, they're like publishing this stuff as it's clear what's happening. We knew anyone who paid attention to the situation knew this was going towards war. I mean, the Americans were already building up their forces in the region, and then you have these leftists like talking about campism and this like ridiculous, smears against those who don't want Canada to engage in imperial aggression. So, that's, and it still continues. It hasn't ended. It's now these people have been put in their place by just the overwhelming horrors of what's happening. And unfortunately, I think the likely scenario here is things are going to keep getting worse, at least for the short term. But yeah, so the big chunk of the left is, full throttle supported this whole project.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions at a time. We'll do Douglas and then Mohammed and then Masood and then Yuri will do after.
Hello, Mona. If you could tell us something about the Iranian community in Canada, and I'm particularly concerned with the predominance of media supporting the Israeli side, because it's owned in Canada, right? How do Iranian Canadians who support the government, do they shy away from public exposure? And talk on those issues, and talk about who are Iranian Canadians, what is the cross section, and how does the Iranian Canadian Congress fit into that?
Thank you for the question. So yes, there's a lot of different opinions in the Iranian diaspora, including in Canada. As Yves mentioned earlier, that there was a wave of immigration out of Iran post-revolution of whoever at the time had sided with the Shah and no longer found themselves in a good position at that time. And there's this diasporic community reflects waves of outward migration from Iran during different periods of time. So their opinions are not representative of what's in Iran, but are perhaps skewed in certain directions. They would be mostly upwardly mobile, middle class and upward individuals. And perhaps with a skew towards those who were dissatisfied with the government in Iran. That being said, there are people who do, in some cases, quite strongly support the Iranian government. Some support it with criticism, in the sense that the Iranian Canadian Congress has members who, some of whom come from a religious background and perhaps support having a religious-based government, but some people come from a secular background. Some people are, what we may be labeled leftist, progressive, various kind of political labels, and the main thing that has brought this community together is, opposition to, sanctions and war on our home country, Iran. There are other aspects of what the Congress does, but that's the main thing that kind of unites us. Because our position, as Yves kind of outlined his own position, but Iranian Canadian Congress also takes more or less the position that we leave Iranian politics, domestic politics, up to Iranians in Iran, and our interlocutor is the Canadian government and Canadian society for the most part, and that's where we believe we will have the most impact as a Canadian organization, because once again, Canada has broken all diplomatic relations with Iran. We don't. I think Yves said that it's stronger has almost isolated in the sense that European countries have diplomatic relations, consular services, but we do not. And so I think that's where we can have the most impact. I don't know if I touched on all aspects of the question.
Can I ask you, Mona, to tell the story about going on CBC Power and Politics?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. So let me also, now I remembered that I think people do shy away in part because of the massive kind of suppression that comes from those, the opposition people. Let me say that last on the weekend I went to the Al-Quds Day protest in support of Palestinians, and we were folding pamphlets to hand out at the at the rally against war on Iran, and a man came up to me and my partner as we were folding these pamphlets, and he was. He asked if I was Iranian. I kind of I was scared that it would be a monarchist. So, and actually he ended up being friendly and said he was scared to go to the protest. He didn't want to go to the protest because he didn't want to engage with those, I'm going to call them Zio monarchists. And those same people are the ones that I guess attacked me after I showed up on Power and Politics merely for quoting Israeli state media, I suppose, because we got attacks on our social media that comments, somewhat vile comments, things that were sort of threats, not criminal threats, but vaguely, vague threats like your days are numbered, and someone even called me a anti-Semitic in an email because I had stated the Israeli media, I suppose. I mean, we're just not allowed to repeat what they say themselves, I think. Yes, and then I was also received mass emails to my employer, who then was worried about my safety and wanted to make sure I was okay, and then said they were filing their own police report and encouraged me to do so. In Montreal, in Canada, I guess there's not really strong anti-doxing sort of, and in the sense of there was defamation. I don't really have the capacity to go to court for that, so that's a different thing. But in terms of Canada, because unless somebody gives a clear criminal threat that they're going to personally come and attack you, the police doesn't do anything. But yeah, those were the circumstances under which I found myself, and I think very many Iranian Canadians are likely to not speak up specifically because of that. And I think particularly the religious community, because they're all under already a lot of racism and discrimination. So some of the, I think that some mosques that are not Iranian, I think are very good at doing politics and supporting Palestine, but as far as I know, the Iranian religious community, they tend to stay quiet because of the immense amount of pressure that has come to them. And I have seen attacks on religious centers too. ICC became aware of at least one physical attack by people with wearing imagery of like a cap with the monarchist symbolism, or the lion and sun symbolism. And in the recent months, I don't know how long it's been. Maybe it's been a couple months since the start of all of that, those attacks. But in the past also, with prior events, we've heard of events of, graffiti being put on Islamic centers. And these, I think I saw in the chat people talking about these, fear mongering around the IRGC and so on. Like I've heard this since as I grew up in Montreal, I've heard these kind of rumors always circulating, so and so is with the Iranian government or something like that. But I've never seen any material evidence of it or, material consequences. So that's the state in which we find ourselves.
Can I just sort of add on to that about the CBC thing to finish the bit off? Is that they apologized for having Mona on and just for talking about sanctions and talking about how there was more context than just Iranian government repressive. And they literally the CBC apologized. And some of the language, Cochrane or whatever his name was, and Dimitri Lascaris did a whole video of this and broke this all down and had Mona on for this. But he was like, basically, we thought we were just going to get the attack the Iranian government perspective, and I'm really sorry. I didn't know that she was going to give more context. And if I would have known that she was going to give more context, I never would have had her on our program. And it's just like basically openly saying that oh, we only want one Iranian Canadian perspective on CBC.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so we're going to try to finish up at 8. So we'll do Mohammed and then Masood for your questions. Oh, Mohammed was hand down. Masood, did you have a question? Not hearing anything. Yuri, did you want to ask a quick question?
Yeah, I mean, sort of in response to the gentleman Samir from Syria, who, I mean, if we can get his email, I would definitely love to have like a discussion with him about because he clearly has legitimate grievances. But I think if I could use the example of my mother's country of the Congo, we had a far right government in the form of Mobutu that was propped up for years by Canada, Britain, France, Belgium, and the US. And I think I remember when he was ousted, I'm pretty sure many people thought that this was going to be the dawn of a golden age of socialism and so forth, except all we got was another Western proxy in the form of Rwanda and Uganda raping and pillaging and destroying the Congo. And ever since Congo's been a democratic republic, it really hasn't changed all of that much. That being said, I would not know what to do. But I think in hindsight, I think it just goes back to what Yves is often promoting, which is we just do no harm. We first do no harm. I think if you think about the West's vendetta against the USSR, and you look at the state of Russia after the fall of communism and the rise of Yeltsin, and all of these libertarians of far right governments in Eastern Europe, that's all because of our color revolutions and a lot of these Western do-gooders thought that they were doing good. And then again, with the Islamic Republic of Iran, France rolled out the red carpet for Khomeini. Britain supported Khomeini because they thought and they knew that they were going to be just as repressive towards the secular left as the Shah. And then Israel was supporting Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. It's only against Iran now because Iran rightly so is very anti-Zionism. So, and I just think in terms of the legitimate grievances that do exist, I think we should support. If anyone's being very much persecuted, we should help those people out and so forth. But in the end of the day, there's no such thing as as our Western imperial states being good faith actors, and I don't think we should fall into the emotional blackmailing that comes sometimes with, well, we must do something about Gaddafi's human rights abuses, or he must do something about Assad's human rights abuses, or he must do something about Mobutu's human rights abuses. And look at us. I mean, we live in like the U.S., Canada, Britain, France, Germany, and so forth, where there is police brutality on a constant basis. And do we want Russia and China to like come and invade our countries and do color revolutions? I think we should think about that. So,
Thank you. Masood, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. You can hear me right now, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I only joined maybe 2/3 of the way through, so this may have been addressed. But before I do get to that question, I want to say I was at that same Al-Quds rally, I think on Saturday. And in the little space, between the when the rally ended, and I was walking towards kind of sort of the Eaton Center, and I happened to have an Iranian flag in my hand. I was actually confronted by some of these monarchists who were walking with, their sun and lion flag, and it kind of came down. I didn't touch anyone, but they tried to start a shoving match. So I just want to make sure everyone understands that there's like in all the maybe 2 years that there's been marches for Palestine, I had not seen anything like that. So everyone should know that, putting aside all the talk about political rights and whatever that the monarchists will have, they are extremely reactionary and repressive people. And my question for both, I guess, Mona and Yves is, in contrast to a lot of maybe previous wars, I think the anti-war movement, at least in the West, has been basically non-existent. And maybe part of that's just due to exhaustion from the previous 2-3 years of the genocide in Palestine. But going forward, how do you anticipate that the kind of organized anti-war movement will evolve in Canada? And is in particular, is the ICC doing any kind of events or advocacy or demonstrations in that regard?
Thank you, Masood. And then Fargo, did you want to ask your question? Then we'll go to the speakers.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi Eve، خانم قاسمی، ممنونم که رسیدیم به اینجا. واقعا افتخار میکنم که امروز میتونیم با ما حرف بزنین. I have a question about the recent publication by the Vancouver police regarding Dr. Masood Masjoudi's murder. It appears that the two prominent Pahlavi activists and organizers have been charged with first-degree murder and I think one charge of desecration of a body in Vancouver, and they'll be attending court on March 25th. I've seen how these organizers have quickly taken hold of the narrative and have put the blame on anti-war activists, Iranian active war activists. And I was wondering if you guys had some insight on how to approach this narrative battle, and if you had any advice to properly address this, which I think is a pretty significant story, considering the Reza Pahlavi's association with Savak collaborators and the presence of Savak collaborators in Canada, which are numerous. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll go to you, Mona, first, and then we'll finish off with Eve.
Sure. So for the first question, I guess I'll try to address that one. It should be quicker and easier. So ICC is collaborating with organizations like, I think I mentioned in my speech, Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, which is an umbrella organization of anti-war networks. And I think that, we'll have the capability, especially through these networks, to engage with various anti-war activists Also, as for protests, we primarily, in Montreal, we collaborate with PYM. And so you can see we'll have joint posts on Instagram for the protests. In other cities, sometimes in Vancouver, I don't think PYM is active. We're active with different organizations, but MVUP, thank you. So Metro Vancouver United for Palestine. So that's, I guess, hopefully addresses that question. As for the, yes, I see in the chat, Fargo is giving more details on Vancouver. As for the case of, I believe it's Dr. Masoud Mashoudi, we wrote a statement of concern regarding violence in the diaspora, which we know is from primarily from, I mean, as far as I know, exclusively from this monarchist faction. And I think we're working on another one in light of the specifics coming out and the individuals being taken into custody. It's very scary, of course, when it gets to this extent, where they are, murder, when murder is involved. Sorry, can you jog me on the question itself?
Yeah, forgive me. I just wanted to ask. There's an imminent narrative battle that's going to come.
Yes.
There's already a narrative push of the alleged murderers being supporters of the Iranian government, which is categorically false.
Yes, and the narrative battle, we're talking to as many people as we can and spreading the word. And I hope that people in this webinar will also continue to do the work by talking to people. But we have to, yes, definitely fight the narrative. I overheard some people the other day just casually chatting and saying it was IRGC who killed this man. Unfortunately I didn't approach them. They were having their own private conversation. But this is the narrative that we're just hearing presented, and I think that's why it's important to talk about these cases as much as possible. Maybe Yves has some additional commentary on that.
The point I think that is important to understand on the big picture level is that the way our media tries to frame all this is that critics of the Iranian government are the ones under pressure and are being threatened by IRGC members and stuff like that. But it's actually the other way around. When it's people who are not on board within the Iranian community, that it's people who are not on board with Canadian policy that are the ones that are being under sort of like different forms of assault, right? And I think that's the IRGC 700 IRGC members in Canada kind of angled at goes back to this global news investigation in 2023, which is literally just a number taken, as I went back to the story for an article I wrote a couple of days ago. It's just a number taken from an anti-IRGC group in Vancouver who's trying to get the IRGC listed on the Canada's terrorism list. And that's the source of this number that is now like being repeated, has been repeated for 3 years. And so people can go back to the article it's on Global News's website. So I think that's the important point to understand is that and so this killing, and I don't think anyone knows like why the individual was killed or why these two people killed him, but it was framed, including by the Guardian, right? Like the UK Guardian, saying that this SFU professor was killed by like the IRGC or Iranian government aligned or whatever, right? That was the framing, and now we know it's two supporters of monarchists that did the killing. Why they did the killing, we don't know exactly, but there is some evidence that they could have done the killing because he had launched a lawsuit against Pahlavi, and so yeah, so that's when we get into narrative, I mean, the lying and the distortion is pretty stark. So, but I think that the important point for us to understand, or to understand in this, is the pressure is not mostly focused on the critics of Canadian policy, or sorry, the critics of the Iranian government. Most of the pressure is actually focused on the critics of Canadian government policy within the Iranian community, and there is clearly a fascistic element that has really grown in strength in recent months and maybe recent years. And then the final thing on terms of the anti-war side, I mean, we can just do what we can do, right? Like, will it blow up to a huge movement? We know that we have public support. There is not public support for Canadian involvement in the war, and we know that public opinion has shifted on Israel as well. So we have a lot at our, a lot of wind at our sails if we are able to get organized and get people out. And then the final thing is just say here in Montreal, there is a demonstration this weekend. I don't know if ICC is part of the coalition, but I think PYM is involved, Urgence Palestine, and I think a couple of other groups. I don't know what it's like in other cities, but I think there's a decent chance there are demonstrations in other cities this weekend. So, we can get out in the streets and make sure that at minimum Canada doesn't give any more military support, and ideally we start going back in the other direction where we get Canada's base out of Kuwait, we get the Canadian troops that are in the region out, and we start changing Canadian policy on the isolation diplomatically and economically of Iran.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers tonight for coming to us and talking to us about this very pertinent topic for sure. Yeah, so this is part of a Capitalism Can't Be Fixed kind of new organization campaign, putting forward anti-imperialist socialist politics. We meet every Wednesday at 6:30 for a different political education session. Next week, we have a critical psychotherapist coming to talk to us about kind of doing activism in this era. So I think that'll be actually really nice. Our campaign has been through a lot. Activists right now are going through a lot with everything. It's very heavy. And it's nice to talk to, somebody who's also an activist themselves, who has a long history of activism, who is trained to, talk to people like us. So I think we're really lucky to have him next week. After that, we have Susan Blacklin. And then I'm thinking that we're still being organized, but we're probably going to have a doctor who was in Palestine, in Gaza, just a few months ago as well. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And yeah,
Thank you so much.
solidarity. Thank you,
Solidarity.
everyone.